It's a joy to be with everyone today to celebrate this Holy Mass. And a special thank you to Kevin Matthews, who spoke to us at the beginning of Mass on this year's Catholic Appeal. And thank you. Just three quick thoughts. We'll get to this more next week, but three things that are on the top of my mind. First, last year was really a remarkable and a difficult year for everybody. But thanks to the generosity of our community, we're actually able to hit our goal number for the Catholic Appeal. So thank you to everyone who gave last year. Your leadership really makes a difference. And two of the differences are this. One, we as a parish family here rely on the ministries of the Archdiocese of Boston. But more than that, when we give to the Catholic Appeal, not only do we help our parish family, but more than that, we help other parish families that aren't as fortunate as us. And if we enjoy a good parish life here, our supporting of other parishes helps them too. So, thank you. Picture this. A husband challenges his wife with the following riddle. You're the engineer of a train. The train has 36 people on board. At the first stop, 12 people get off and 5 get on. At the next stop, no one gets off and 7 people get on. At the third stop, 14 people get off and 2 get on. Now for the question. What's the name of the engineer? How should I know? Snapped the wife. See, said the husband, you never listen. Right at the start, I said, you're the engineer of a train. How often are you too busy thinking about what you're going to say than actually listening to someone? And if this happens in our day-to-day conversations, is it a surprise that we fail to listen to God? Today, as we continue our Lenten journey, we're going to be talking about listening. Before the gospel scene, which we just heard, Jesus was preaching and healing in Caesarea Philippi with his disciples. There were crowds of people and lots of activity. Following this, our gospel begins. We see Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. This trip up to the top of Mount Tabor might seem like a detour from their mission, but really, it's Jesus bringing the inner circle of his disciples to a place where they can listen. Throughout the gospel, there are a number of scenes where Jesus leaves the hustle and the bustle of the crowd to go off alone by himself or with a few of his disciples, so that he can listen, so that he can talk to his Father. For the disciples, as well as for us, stepping away from the busyness of life gives us the silence we need to hear God. God's voice often comes to us in the quiet whisper of everyday life. But too much busyness is like spiritual noise pollution. This constant activity impedes our ability to listen to God's voice. Constantly moving from one thing to the next makes us lose touch with our thoughts, our feelings, and our desires. And more than that, it makes us lose touch of those of others. For instance, have you ever tried talking to somebody whose mind is preoccupied with something else? Maybe that person is you. You see, the more our life is ruled by the urgent, the more we lose sight of the important. And very often, the important thing that we lose sight of is God or others. In the gospel, the physical movement of Jesus and the disciples moving or walking up Mount Tabor represents the necessity for us to rise above the busyness of the day. We need the unobstructed view that a mountaintop gives, because life is bigger than what our eyes can see, especially when we're cramped by activity. We read on in the gospel, now they're at the top of the mountain, and it said, Jesus was transfigured before them. One moment, Jesus looks like any of us, nothing special to attract our attention. The next, his divine glory, which was so perfectly veiled by the humanity he assumed, shines through. It's kind of like the reverse of what happens in the Eucharist. In the Eucharist, Jesus' glory, his real presence, his body, blood, soul, and divinity are truly present. But it's perfectly veiled for our eyes. But on the mountain, that divine glory shined through. We read on in the gospel. Then Elijah appeared to them, along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets, who paved the path for the coming of the Messiah. Their presence makes clear that Jesus isn't a rupture with all of God's previous activity in the world, but rather its continuation and its fulfillment. For us, it's easy to forget the past, but the past is an important means by which God speaks to us. In fact, every sorrow, joy, or regret that is in your past, in one way or another, helped bring you to this moment. And if you think that God, if you're sure that God has worked in your past, you can trust him to work in your future. For Peter, James, and John, this memory of the transfiguration would then strengthen them for every adversity which they would face as their lives went on. And so it is for us. When we remember the glories or the presence or the ways that God has acted in our lives, we are strengthened for every adversity we feel. And we read on in the gospel, and we get to the point where, Peter ruins the moment by opening his mouth. He says, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Sometimes we just have to enjoy the moment and recognize that nothing we say can add anything to it. And further, we can't control every situation that we're in. And what's more, when we do all of the talking, we do none of the listening. Because these two activities are mutually exclusive. You cannot talk and listen at the same time. Before the pandemic began, I went out to supper with Father Gabriel. And that night it happened to be a slow night in the restaurant. There were only a few people at tables, but of course, we were seated right next to one other group. And at that group, there was a person who spoke loudly the entire time. It seemed like the only time this person stopped talking was when they took a sip of water or a bite of food and they jumped right back in again. I tried my best not to get annoyed, but I ended up complaining to Father Gabriel. And if you know Father Gabriel, you know that he's very wise and he always has the best way of saying things. So he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Gerald, just be grateful you're not seated at that table." So much of the noise that keeps us from listening to God's voice comes from ourselves. And sometimes the best thing that you can do to hear God's voice is to simply be quiet. You know, someone once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason." The scene of the Transfiguration continues. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. And from the cloud came a voice which said, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Jesus speaks to all people of all ages, and I would highlight especially for our purposes here and today that especially includes me now and you now. The message of the gospel that Jesus gives us is always relevant to our lives, no matter what we're facing. You might hear hundreds of homilies, but none are as powerful as listening to the voice of Jesus for yourself in Scripture or in prayer. But it takes motivation and discipline. Discipline to walk away from the noise, to turn off social media, to stop talking, and anything else that keeps you from listening. We can confuse busyness with being productive and important, but we have to take time out of our day to listen to Jesus. Today's gospel ends with Jesus and his disciples heading down the mountain to go back to their regular activities. They're going back, but with a change. They've had a mountaintop experience. They've seen God's glory, and that will be for them a guiding light for the rest of their lives. Will they get it right all the time? No, of course not. But every time they now stray from the path, they'll come back. St. John Newman said that change is the logic of life. To live is to change. And to be holy is to have changed several times. The teaching today is simple. Listen and change. And if you listen, what do you think Jesus is trying to say to you? How is Jesus inviting you to change your life?